Welcome to another episode of the Tom Schimmer Podcast. Happy to have everyone along this week again, and a special welcome to any new listeners joining in for the first time, or any of you who've just recently subscribed to the podcast. I really do appreciate that. Before we get going today, I just want to quickly remind you to subscribe to the podcast YouTube channel. Just search Tom Schimmer Podcast on YouTube and you should find it. Full episodes of the podcast are there, along with the video versions of the interviews. We usually post it a few weeks after the podcast goes live, but they can be really great for PD sessions. So if you hear something in the interview that you think would make for a good clip to show that clip, stimulate some dialogue amongst your colleagues, go ahead and subscribe to that. As I said last week, I'm also hoping to add some other shorter, single topic, quick hitter kind of videos as well this year. So stay tuned for that. I'm also planning to do a few live sessions in the near future, so subscribing to the channel will keep you alerted to that. And also Facebook. This year I've done a few Facebook live sessions, and I may schedule a few Facebook live conversations for the podcast, so if you haven't done so already, search and maybe like Schimmer Education on Facebook, if you're on Facebook, to keep up to date on that. So, and look, I might as well mention Instagram. Podcast is on Instagram as well, so it's at Tom Schimmer Podcast on Instagram. So no shortage of social media platforms. Your listening and subscribing to the podcast means a lot, and I really do appreciate the support. And if you feel up to spreading the word on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or wherever, I would greatly appreciate that. Again, just wanting to continue to expand the conversation and expand the listening audience, so I appreciate that. Today, I'm really excited to have my friend and educational force, Rick Wormeli, joining me for the interview. His influence in education, of course, is well documented, and we had what I thought was an awesome conversation, so really excited about that. In Assessment Corner this week, I'm going to address the topic of atypical assessment methods and looking at different formats and the way that kids can show what they know, especially when you're talking about a virtual environment. So specifically, I want to provide some details around the idea of engineering conversations and also observation in general. So that's the plan for today. I'm really excited about this episode, so let's get to it. We'll have my conversation with Rick Wormeli coming up shortly, but first, don't at me. But I want to open this week with some thoughts about the responsibility that surrounds professional judgment and, on a larger scale, professional autonomy. I think one of the aspects that separates a JOB from a profession is the level of professional judgment and decision-making, and nowhere do you find that more in education than around assessment and grading, when teachers have to use their professional judgment to make indirect scoring inferences to decide the degree to which a student has either met a singular learning outcome or the collection of learning goals relevant to the reporting period. Now, we talked on a couple of previous podcasts about rubrics and how we develop clear criteria to make those judgments. Rubrics aren't really a choice per se, meaning we don't just flip a coin to decide yay or nay to a rubric. Of course, we don't make rubrics for the sake of making rubrics. We make rubrics to make performance criteria transparent. Now, indirect scoring inferences are more the norm now, or at least should be, because learning goals, outcomes, standards, etc. are becoming increasingly more sophisticated and far less binary. They aren't really, unless you're at the very youngest grade levels, they're no longer about right, wrong, yes, no, can, can't types of goals. They are standards that really can be presented and also examined along gradations of quality, which is what a rubric in any of its forms really does describe. So unless we lower the collective cognitive rigor of the standards and outcomes, the need for teachers to use their judgment is not going away. And of course, the idea of using your professional judgment or professional autonomy on a larger scale, it's not just about assessment. It's about so many other aspects of the job. Now, Tom Guskey, who, of course, you recall from episode 1, was my first guest on the podcast, and Leanne Young, who will be a future guest on the podcast in the near future, wrote an article about this in 2016. It appeared in Educational Leadership in the April edition, and it was entitled, Grading, Why You Should Trust Your Judgment. Now, a few salient points from that article. 1, despite their many advantages, computerized grading programs also have drawbacks. In particular, their pervasive use has caused teachers to doubt their professional judgment. 2, Tom and Leanne say, we should trust our minds, not our machines. Because 3, computers only use numbers. They know nothing of the individual students who produce those numbers, the learning environment, or the nature of the quality of the assessments. So to that point, the 4th is that broader knowledge more often leads teachers to make fair, accurate, and meaningful judgments. One thing I've been saying for years, and I may have mentioned this on a previous pod, but I don't really remember because it seems like the more episodes I put out, the easier it's becoming to forget what I said before. But anyway, one of the things that I've been saying is for years is that the electronic gradebook has been simultaneously the best and worst invention in education. We've never been more clinically efficient, but we've lost the art of grading, right? We've lost the art of our professional judgment. And what was unfortunate was that the renaissance in assessment in the late 90s and early 2000s coincided with the tech explosion during that same period. So that kind of made us sort of skew toward those electronic gradebooks. Now we need to, if you haven't already, recapture our professional judgment and our professionalism in general. Now, of course, I don't mean that teachers aren't professional. They are, of course. What I'm referring to is our professionalism in terms of using our judgment. Electronic gradebooks have caused many to simply either defer to the calculation, or for others, it's actually provided cover. It's provided an opportunity to hide behind the numbers, if you will. And with a shrug, we could sort of say, well, I didn't give that to you. That's how the grade came out. And with autonomy comes great responsibility, or so it should. Professional autonomy or judgment shouldn't just be awarded, so to speak, unchecked. Because you've been hired as a teacher, it shouldn't automatically mean, hey, use your judgment and your autonomy. See you in 30 years. That's, to me, not the point. We have to work at developing our judgment to be consistent. We have to ensure our autonomy is in alignment with the larger goals of the system. Now, back in 2009, Linda Darling-Hammond offered these important and maybe somewhat sobering thoughts. First, she said, quote, "For the occupations that require discretion and judgment in meeting the unique needs of clients, the profession guarantees the competence of members in exchange for the privilege and professional control over work structure and standards of practice." End quote. Now, I understand there are many teachers who feel they don't have control over their work structure or their standards of practice, but that is often what negotiations are about, contracts, collective agreements, etc. And I know that for some of you, you are in situations where you feel you have little to no control over that. I get that. But we still have the responsibility inside the classroom. So what is our responsibility? Our responsibility is to guarantee our competence, to continue to learn, to grow, and to make sure that we are positioned to use our judgment, our autonomy, the right way. Now, Tom and Leanne concluded their article with the following statement, quote, "Teachers who trust their own minds, knowing that informed colleagues would likely make the same judgment, offer grades that communicate meaningful and reliable information to all," end quote. Now, did you catch that middle part? Knowing that informed colleagues would likely make the same judgment. So let's break that down. Knowing. Well, that would have to imply, infer, etc., that there was some sort of collaborative effort to work together. So there would have to be knowledge of what one another are doing. Informed colleagues, okay? Informed meaning they must have the fluency, the capacity, and the understanding to make the judgments that we're asking them to make. And then same judgment, right? That speaks to the reliability, since the same learning goals are being assessed, right? So there's reliability amongst the team. Now, the second passage from Linda Darling-Hammond is as follows. Quote, "Professional authority does not mean legitimizing the idiosyncratic or whimsical preferences of individual classroom teachers. It is precisely because practitioners operate autonomously that safeguards to protect the public interest are necessary." End quote. Professional judgment or autonomy does not reserve one's right to go rogue and indulge your idiosyncratic or your whimsical preferences, especially when it comes to making judgments about the degree to which students have learned. Now, I trust teachers, but we're up against it as society has a history of not trusting teacher decision-making. You see this especially in places where there's a heavy emphasis and influence of standardized testing. So what are we to do? Well, we can complain about it because, of course, complaining always works, hashtag sarcasm. Or we can do one of two things, and likely we need to do both. First, we need to raise our game when it comes to our professional learning and growth as it relates to using our judgment. While my experience has shown me the vast majority of teachers take their professional learning seriously, it only takes a few. And it shouldn't be up to just the principal or the district office to hold people accountable. Don't let your colleagues off the hook, because the dismissiveness with which a few, and I want to emphasize the few because we're talking about the vast minority here, the dismissiveness with which some treat professional learning is undercutting all of us as a profession. Now, the second thing is to make our already raised games more overt and obvious, so to speak. Now, most in the public are ignorant to two things. One, how challenging the job of teaching is, COVID or no COVID. And sure, with some of the home learning environments and distance learning and remote learning and all the things that we've been dealing with through COVID, many parents have gained a real appreciation for how challenging the job is. But most in the general public don't really understand the intricacies of the job. And two, they don't understand how much teachers invest in their professional growth once they're hired. We need to make that more obvious to the school community and the community at large. Do I wish that weren't the case? Of course. But what I wish and what is are two different things. The one thing we are not good at in education is PR, partially because we shouldn't have to be, and partially because our sole focus is on learners. But until we decide to counter the narratives that are out there that are running amok, nothing is going to change. And I'm not talking about countering it with defensiveness. We can't keep telling those outside the system, oh, you don't have the whole picture, but then never give them the whole picture. Our judgments have to be defensible, of course, but our judgments are what make us the professionals we are. We need to reclaim that and then present it proactively, make it overt and obvious, to show how we will ensure that our professional judgments remain professional and won't devolve into some unreliable or indefensible decision-making. Let me finish with a little bit of math. And I'm going to use the example of a high school teacher. Now, the disclaimer for this exercise is that, of course, situations vary across schools and people have had various amounts of experience, and I get that. This is just ballpark math, okay? So this is a hypothetical. It's ballpark math, but you'll understand the point I'm trying to make. Let's start with a high school teacher that's taught for 15 years, okay? 15 years and has taught an average of 7 classes per year. So we're talking about 105 total classes over the course of the 15 years. And let's put an average of 30 students per class. And again, there might be more or less, but let's put an average of 30 students per class. So that's 3,150 students. Now let's say the teacher utilizes 25 assignments to determine the student's overall proficiency. That's 78,750 student samples. And I didn't even add in the informal moments, the formative assessment, the feedback, all of the other aspects. So I think you could conservatively double it to say that after 15 years, a teacher has probably consumed somewhere around 157,500 student samples. No one will ever convince me that teachers don't have the experience and the professional know-how to judge proficiency along a few gradations of quality. We have to stop hiding behind the numbers, stop handing over our professional judgment to a computerized spreadsheet, and start reclaiming that which truly makes our profession a profession. I'm thrilled to have Rick Wormeli joining me today for the interview. Rick, of course, is a globally recognized educational leader and force in so many areas, including middle-level education, differentiation, and of course, assessment and grading, and the list goes on. I'm going to give you the quick rundown, listeners, of the biography. Rick is one of the first nationally board certified teachers in America. Much of Rick's work has been featured by numerous national media outlets, including featured on Good Morning America. He is a columnist for AMLE magazine and a frequent contributor to ASCD's Educational Leadership magazine. Rick, of course, is the author of several books, including the award-winning Meet Me in the Middle, as well as several bestsellers, including Day One and Beyond, and of course, the wildly popular Fair Isn't Always Equal, Assessment and Grading in the Differentiated Classroom. Rick has been a presenter and a featured workshop presenter all over the world, literally all over the world. And he has been the recipient of several awards over the course of his careers. And listeners, that is just the abridged version of the biography. This man has had an absolutely ridiculous career. So, Rick, I am thrilled that you're able to join us. So, Rick, welcome to the Tom Schimmer podcast.
Hey, thank you very much. I feel like this is a stepping stone to going intergalactic.
Intergalactic, I love that. We were just talking earlier about when I was putting together the biography and looking over just sort of the things you've done. It was reminded when I looked at all the places you've presented around the world about our dinner in Beijing, where we just happened to be in China together in 2016, and here we are halfway around the world, and just minutes from one another and being able to have dinner. So that was great. And it's a good memory.
That's a synergy that it's so rare, but it's so exciting. And you feel like, let's do this more often.
That's right.
Combine our powers for good and not evil.
It certainly breaks up the eating alone aspect of the job. That's for sure.
Truly.
Absolutely. Okay, so Rick, let's jump in. We are definitely going to get to some educational topics, but I really feel like I have to start with the events of January 6th and the attack on the Capitol in Washington, D.C. You live just 20 miles from D.C., from the White House and the Capitol, and so this, in some ways, must have really hit close to home to you. I know for so many of us, even those of us outside of the United States, it was an emotionally jarring day. And the images and the accounts of what happened are things that will go down in history. The attack has been universally condemned outside of those who are trying to spin it or justify it or deflect it. My question to you, Rick, is not how do you feel about the events, because I think we all sort of know how we feel about the events. But as an American citizen, as someone who lives very close to the Capitol, how are you feeling about, the events in the wake of what happened in January 6th? How are you personally feeling about the situation and circumstances currently?
Initially, I'm just extremely upset, very disappointed. When I work with people around the world, when I first arrive, I usually say, yeah, we're interested in your topic today, but can you just answer this question, WTF, or more politely, WTH? What the heck is going on with you guys in the United States? And it's usually, the past 4 or 5 years with the current administration that it's about to leave. And, why would somebody do that? This policy and that policy. And I have to explain, I really don't know. And my Republican friends are stumped as well, because they feel like it's a splitting of the Republican Party, of which Trump and the current administration, of course, is supposed to be the head of it. And it's inconsistent. It's out of alignment, with that. And, I'll be the first to tell you we're an imperfect union. And I think that ego has gotten a lot in the way. Like, I really am repelled by this notion of, they're number one, United States is number one, and it's exclusive nation and so on. That's not the thing we want to be known for. We want to be known for compassion and intelligence and problem solving and generosity of the world with agriculture and anything else we can possibly do. But we've got this idea that we're some kind of elitist thing, and it's been a comeuppance. So now the question is whether or not our systems can weather and navigate such troubling waters as they are. And I'm really struck by, other people have said this, so I'm not the originator of this thought, but every generation, I think, sits there and goes, oh my gosh, this is who we are. We're not like this, but really we are. And we have to lift the rug and look what we've been sweeping under this whole time. And I do think a lot of it is racist in nature. I do think that there's also people are struggling economically and they're threatened and they're in survival mode and they feel like, oh no, we got to take this over. I'm very concerned about QAnon kind of radicalizing people. And these are people who don't have hope elsewhere, so they put their hope in this thing. And so the United States needs to get better at being worthy of our citizens' hope and aspirations. And we're not quite there yet. So we need some leaders who can do that. And I think, past presidents have been better than, the current one right now. And most of my Republican friends are like, why is our Republican leader doing this? So I don't know a lot of people that are supportive, although obviously the heck of a lot of people voted for him there. When I try to explain it, I'm also struck by, what if I was in the classroom? Because I'm out of the classroom right now. What if I was in the classroom trying to explain, when a leader is quite a bit narcissistic in what he does, and it's not so much about the Constitution, the country, as it is about him. And yet we tell students that, the presidential office is an honorable office. Our government is sound. We have, checks and balances and all this stuff. And yet it falls apart, from time to time. So I'm very concerned about people who don't have a savvy in logical fallacy. They don't understand that that's an inconsistent thing and they're trying to prove a point and it's ultimately weak. And that people are duped by, again, fake news, but not having that intelligent consumer savvy. And then I did some work with Sandra Day O'Connor and her work on iCivic, which is a program to teach the next generation, really, truly, what are the 5 or 6 protections under the First Amendment, to understand how these things really work, because a lot of people are truly illiterate with it. They interviewed adults and they didn't know and understand a lot of this stuff. What are your rights and responsibilities when you're stopped by a police officer for a traffic violation? That sort of thing. People just didn't have any idea. And there was just this sense of, it's easier just to rebel, which is kind of a cowardly thing to do, rather than to dig in and really try to understand it and respond constructively.
Right.
So I realize that people are in dire circumstances. We've had a huge increase in opioid abuse, alcoholism, depression, anxiety. Totally get that. And people are so scared and they're frustrated. And this might be a manifestation of that fear and that anxiety. I totally get that. But it's not the way we claim to be. And so now if we claim this, then let's stop minimizing our hypocrisy and get closer and closer to our values and have integrity again. But that takes courage of conviction to see it through the tough times.
Yeah.
And I don't think everybody has the supports they need to do that. Like, we're in the States, at least in most places in the States, we're terrible at supporting people who are dealing with mental illness. And it's a stigma. And we need to absolutely change that, dramatically so people get the help they need and don't turn to other vices and things as a way to cope. So I don't know. I have mixed feelings. Initially terrified because we live so close. And what we did here in our neighborhood is, we have an internet just for our neighborhood, and everybody sent out, yes, my brother who works security at the Capitol or the National Guard or whatever, they're safe, they're fine. We have a lot of friends who work downtown. And we're like, are you okay? Did you get home okay? And, one friend had to stay over in a hotel. Wow. And at night, because he couldn't get out of the city, things were locked down. He was worried about this stuff. So he stayed over, but he happened to stay over in a hotel, that was being used by a lot of the rioters. And it was, they were uproarious, they were celebrating, and he was angered. But, if you say something, then it's just all directed at you. Yeah. So what do you do? And so his place was, I will go in my room and try to keep safe, but I will work towards, this not being what happens, on a daily basis, or is the only turn that people have when they feel like they've been wronged by their government to some degree. So anyway, I guess that's a mixed message there, but it's kind of where I am.
Well, you are where you are for sure. It's an interesting dynamic, obviously, for myself as a Canadian. I think sometimes, and I made mention of this in last week's podcast, which is I think sometimes, and I understand why, this isn't meant to be a shot, but I think sometimes Americans forget the impact that instability in the United States has around the world. Every democracy looks to the United States for stability. And while your comments are fair in terms of stop saying we're the greatest country or all of those different things, there is the beacon of democracy and freedom that the longest undefended border is between Canada and the United States. So our countries are very close, and we look to the United States. And it was an emotionally jarring day for even people who don't live in the United States, who aren't citizens, because we know that there are global actors that would look to take advantage of that kind of instability. The other thing is you were responding, Rick, that I want to pick up on, which I've seen several times, is this notion of how many times can we keep, and this isn't exclusive to the situation last week, this would be ubiquitous in anyone's life or any organization's life. How many times can you keep saying, this is not who we are, until you start to realize this is who we are? And this is what we have to reconcile, because do you think that acknowledgement is what's going to be necessary to bring the unity? And it seems a lot of people are trying to push unity and healing right now without there being that step in between, which is the acknowledgement and the awareness of where things currently are right now. Thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, everybody has an inherited narrative of what they think is normal and preferred. And when you pose conflict to that, people are going to get very defensive really fast because you pull the rug out from underneath them.
Mm-hmm.
And so now what do they hold on to in an insecure world? And you've removed that guardrail, so to speak. So the idea, so much of our country has been rewritten by people who were in power at the time. So they have this idea of like blacks and whites and Japanese and others from around the world who are immigrants, Native American people, First Nations, and so on. And like, I put them in this classification. And now you're telling me that my whole perception was wrong and that they actually were doing all those other things that, I'm not comfortable with that because I'm already scared as an individual human. Yeah. And so I think that is probably going to be one of the big turns from 2020, the big outcomes from it, is racism, but also the politics. It has been so toxic. And I'm struck by so much of what happened during the 1960s in the States. It was civil unrest and so on, and what was going on. And there are some parallels between that and what's going on now. Disillusionment, oh no, I now have to rip up or dismantle my aspirational model, my exemplar of what I thought was. Mm-hmm. And when you confront anyone, let alone like educators too, with their hypocrisy, it doesn't always go well because we tend to irrationally rationalize things. Right. And now we're forced to look at something that is distasteful, unsettling, ugly, and realize, oh, we've been just operating in hopes that no one would find out that other stuff or pay attention to it. No, look over here, please. Because we're not over there. We're over here. You need to keep your eyes over here. Nothing to see there, people. And now we open it up and it hurts. It changes, painful. It's hard. And it's no longer comforting. And in a pandemic, an economic crisis, and the political toss-ups back and forth, we want comfort food and we're not getting it. And so who's really going to survive is the ones who are strong enough to realize that it's messy. And you're trying to impose disorder on, you try to impose order on disorder, and you're not comfortable with ambiguity, it's going to drive you nuts. Yeah. So people who are flexible and willing to say, no, I'm willing to do the hard work. Yes, I can become aware, but then how do I make that actionable to do something about it? That's incredibly hard. So how do I confront neighbors, friends, relatives who espouse something that is just abhorrent to me ethically, or to say, oh no, I need to keep the peace? Well, the time for that is over. You need to find the constructive way, maintain relationship if you want, but to say, no, you know what, we can be better than this. Let's aspire together, and let me hold you accountable to a common humanity and a sense of mercy and compassion and grace that these comments of yours are not espousing, but you've said before, that's what you want to do. Right. So the idea that we're wildly, hugely inconsistent in our own philosophies and values, we have to accept. It's not a perfect thing. We're imperfect people running an imperfect system. Right. But can we extend forgiveness to each other? And again, disagree on things, but still have civil discourse is huge. And I think one of the big outcomes of that is that we're going to renew courses on civics and civil discourse in our schools, and debate, forensic competitions, as opposed to turning to fists and violence and vandalism. To pull that off, I think will be a positive outcome. It's kind of like the idea of, upsetting the apple cart isn't always a bad thing. This one is terrifying and inappropriate, but a little bit of upsetting it, yeah, that we're due for that, and it's a
Yeah.
healthy thing.
It's as you're talking there, you're talking about civil discourse, and it the idea that it's time to push back, it's time to speak up, it's time to confront, but it's not the time to do those things in the manner with which others are
Yeah.
asserting their position. It's a way, the art of this, I think, is going to be how we confront and how we speak up without resorting to the tactics that got us upset in the first place. I think
Yeah,
that's
and
going to
I
be some
think a
of the
lot of them
interesting.
don't have the skills to do that, and
Right.
we need to get those skills in their hands.
Yeah. Can we just pivot now a little bit to school? Because, everything today, obviously, we've been talking, everything today feels political. And I said, last week on the podcast, if a once in a century pandemic can become political, then anything can become political. So when it comes to now, let's sticking with the events of January 6th and the subsequent climate, but focusing on teachers and schools. A lot of questions came out on January 7th or even the evening of the 6th, which is, how am I going to talk about this? Right. So now
Mm.
students' emotions, their opinions, some students will have some very definitive positions about what happened, and some in the public feel that teachers and educators in general really shouldn't get political at all. So at the same time, what happened and what the current climate is so intense that to not talk about it would feel so inauthentic and disjointed. So my question to you is, and maybe you've been asked this question already, which is, how do teachers and educators, principals, how do we talk about the truth of what happened in this current climate without becoming political or without becoming overly political? How do we talk about what happened on January 6th?
I think you cannot escape education being political. And the first step is to accept that all education is political to some degree. If I choose not to comment, that's a choice, and it's a political choice not to comment, not to get in there. If I choose to comment in a certain way, that's political as well. So first we have to realize that it is political, and you can't avoid being or not being political. It's just going to happen. But the other thing is, can we be sensitive to different viewpoints, and can we model that in front of kids? What I find is that students, particularly in middle school and high school, are, let alone the bottom line fundamental questions of a primary child, but in young adolescents and adolescents, they want a model of how to think about things, and they turn to us as exemplars of how to think. How do you navigate such a difficult time and a challenging thing? And they want to sort their thinking. And a lot of kids, and some adults to some degree, they sort their thinking based on what people they respect say and what they do. And I think we need to model how to do that. I disagree with this policy, and here's why. But I understand that some people might have this viewpoint, and here's why they have that. So I wonder how we could progress together is a legitimate thing. Now, I've been wrestling with this for decades when we talk about racism and homophobia and Muslim bans and things like that, because people are saying, well, Mr. Wormeli, what do you think? Students will come up and ask that.
Right.
Transgender use of bathrooms, that sort of thing. And I say, well, there's really a couple of things there. One is, are you asking me as an employee of the Commonwealth of Virginia, or are you asking me as an individual voter? Tell me what your mom and dad said first, and then I'll tell you what I say,
Right.
just so I have the context as we're doing that. And then I'll say, sometimes if it's really contentious, I'll ask mom and dad, is it appropriate? Is it okay for me to have this conversation with your child if we need to? But in general, I think that we need to be the models of how do you constructively deal with this in your own life and disagree with people, because students are desperate. They're starved for that. And if they don't have that model, they'll resort to inappropriate acts, to negotiate this. And there'll be nothing to build on there as you go through and do it. So the idea of, if we have a really strong disagreement, let's vote, let's do something, let's change the legislature, that sort of thing, not turn to violence. And that I would also remind them that what are 1,000 other ways you could have done this besides physical violence or vandalism to do this? And what do you do if you're just so distraught and in such despair, you feel like there's no choice but to do something really radicalizing or harmful to others? Is that how do we respond to that in our lives? Some of that is just simple, self-regulation and executive function, things that kind of come together and work very nicely with students. And we can certainly teach those things, but I have colleagues that I respect very much that say you should always remain neutral. And I think there's some common humanity virtues of which we don't need to remain neutral. Like it is a positive to be compassionate. It is a positive to extend mercy to others. It is a positive to try to understand from somebody else's point of view where they're coming from before you make your response. To try to I listen so that I understand, like Stephen Covey, but instead of listening just to make sure I can form ammunition for my rebuttal, which is a very different way of doing things. So we can teach kids those skills and we can model them in front of them. And we can also just sit in sadness, literally just being quiet. And if we're back in the classroom, maybe an arm around the shoulder and just sit in sorrow together and saying, we're sharing this humanity together. And I have no answers, but I'm willing to listen to you share what upsets you about this is actually a great gift, is to be that listener. I always thought that one of the greatest tools a teacher ever had was the ear, the listening ear. And we so rarely use it. We just prejudge right away because we got to go. We got to keep momentum and we don't have time for this nonsense here. But truly just listening to them, that means their voice was important enough to be heard and that they make good company and that what they say matters. That might be the way that we kind of help orchestrate that. But if they do press us for our opinion, I think we could probably frame it in such a way as this is what I believe, and it's based on my experience and my narrative. But you might have a different experience, a different narrative, and I really want to understand that. So here I am. I'm going to ask you questions and behave in such a way that shows that I value the entire identity that is you, rather than dismissive of it because it's not my identity. If that makes sense.
It does. And the idea of asking questions, I learned that lesson the hard way years ago, early in my career, about being too quick to answer, a question from a student without asking clarifying questions, or, why do you ask? Where are you going with this? And I think that you can get a greater sense of maybe maybe it's just an inquiry, or maybe they are trying to, a high school student maybe trying to entice you into a political debate or something like that. And I think you're right. I mean, there are certain topics that just represent basic humanity, and the idea that there's both sides is kind of a false equivalency. But
I agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, we can debate economic policy. You can say, okay, well, I think this and I think that, and there's a fair debate to be had. But there are some things that really shouldn't be up for debate. And by asserting our position at some point collectively, we force people in some respects, respectfully and with finesse, we force them to justify these inhumane perspectives to policies that just seem to be on paper, that idea. So I love the idea of the fact that we honor the students' question, and we honor their inquiry, and the idea of contacting the parents as well, I think is a great strategy. So I think it's very thoughtful. I want to shift now to teaching during COVID. With all that's happened, everything you described in the earlier part of this interview was, the economics, the opioid crisis, the political climate. Oh, by the way, a once a century pandemic. So here we go. So many of us, I know you have, and others, and Tom Guskey and others, we've been talking about the potential silver linings that might come from the pandemic educationally. No one is saying that this is a good thing. Let's just get that right. But from your perspective, what educational good things are you seeing emerge, grow, or expand during this incredibly challenging time?
Well, a couple of things. The first thing about which I'm most excited is that I think a lot of teachers were teaching through personality and through physical environment more than pedagogy, the science and craft of it. And now they realize I can't just do the things I normally relied upon to manage the class, but also to engage students, to have a really effective lesson, and just jam it through a camera lens. And suddenly it comes out the other side and the kids are learning just like they ever did before. So a part of their pedagogy is, I need to actually go back to the fundamentals of how the brain learns. Like, oh man, I have to do a lot more with relationships because I was forming relationships by just talking to them in the hallways in between, or whatever it might have been, in the corridors. And I can't do that anymore. I don't have that interaction anymore. And then I was just assuming that when you came into the institution of school and came in and sat down at a desk, all the protocols just kind of settled in with you and we were ready to rock and roll. And now I got, oh, wait a minute. We have to figure out a way to conduct ourselves, and it might be slightly differently, through the lens and distancing. So the idea of people renewing their focus on cognitive science and how the brain learns, literally how do 13-year-olds best learn, and how's that different than 8-year-olds or freshmen versus seniors, in high school? They're different animals. And so I should teach in a way that's developmentally appropriate for them. So a real diving deeper into that. And then how do I manifest that? So it's almost taking a lot of seasoned veterans back to their roots of being a first-time teacher again.
Right.
How do I reinvent myself in alignment with what I know? Oh, wait a minute, I don't know the latest, so I need to get up to speed. So I think that is a real positive. Another thing that I think is happening is we have curriculum overload. We've tried to jam too much in as it is. And what people are finding with remote instruction is that you can't get through the same curriculum. You can't do justice to all of it. And the idea of mastery or competence in something, oh, what a joke. Those are really misnamed compared to what we do. So I'm taken with Heidi Hayes Jacobs and her 4 C's that she's been promoting quite a bit this in 2020, that we have to decide, what are we going to cut back? What are we going to cut out? What are we going to consolidate? And what do we need to create? And the idea that we have to look at standards or learner objectives and outcomes and decide, all right, these are the 4 to 8 most pivotal and leveraging for the whole year. These are secondary level. They're important, but less so. And this third level, nice to know, but like Elsa, let it go, as they do that. And we have to put on our big adult pants and do the heavy lifting and say, this is so leveraging for what's to come. We will spend our time and energy on that because we can't do all of it like we used to.
Right.
So I think there's going to be a thinning or culling of curriculum that is a positive.
Yeah.
Less is more in my mind. The United States has always been, let's compare ourselves to other countries. And Korea and Germany and others, I've noticed they, in math and science and some others, they have far fewer standards than we do. But their kids do better on some of the international tests and so on. They seem to understand it better. And I'm struck by, looking at schools in Japan and Korea and in some places like that, where they might say, tonight, I want you to do 35 of these practice problems. And, we would say that to get fast at it, but they would say, hey, you know what? Here's one problem. I want you to build a model of the mathematical concept there. In other words, they're at concept attainment night 1 and 2 of homework. Night 3, they might do, extended practice, get efficient, get automatic at it. But United States, we just tend to, and in other places I've seen in Canada too, you say, hey, here's the algorithm, now practice a bajillion of them. Now we're going to the next thing the next day. And there's no chance to really explore it in depth. And so it creates an opaque look at it. It's just kind of putting a shine over what we do and saying, oh yeah, that's mastery, but it's really not teaching for mastery. The capacity to spiral back and revisit things to make sure you can carry it forward. And you're agile and versatile in its application. You can handle novelty and curveball, whacked out applications and notions of it, subtlety and finesse, all these different things. I think that's going to be a positive as well, that we're going to do that. And I think that teacher appreciation and wellness. So the mental health of teachers will get new attention, but also appreciation of teachers for what they do, given what has now been happening with so many parents now having to force to teach their children at home and schools not being in session. Those are positive. I think the idea of becoming much more divergent and paying attention to one's own intellect and creative self, because that atrophies when you've been teaching the same thing for a few years in a row or longer. So I got to go back and go, I got to think way differently than I did before and not just rely on what I used to do. And that's okay. And then probably the biggest moment for me would be to deal with inequities. They've just only exacerbated to a huge dramatic degree. That the difference between the haves and the have-nots has only become worse. And that's going to cause people to go, you know what? I used to give it lip service and say Hallmark card platitudes of niceness about stuff, but I never really put skin in the game, so to speak. I never really dug in and got into it. It's kind of like people who are clicktivists. They click on something or they forward it like I like this, I like that. And they think, well, look at me, I've done my civic duty. And no, you have to show up and you have to talk to people and you have to do the hard work, the footwork of it. And that's going to be a difference. I think more and more people are going to be willing to do that because it's just revealed so much more. And it's so much more of a painful hurt in our heart. But we're going to be looking to leaders to give us skills and routes that are constructive to do that.
Hmm. We really do. I was just on the one hand really impressed by how so many school districts responded in the spring with, devices, bandwidth, all
Yeah.
of that stuff, and yet at the same time you think it took a global pandemic for us to realize that there's inequities within, for
Yeah.
access,
Right.
right? We could have been working on high speed internet. We could have been working on devices long before that. So I don't want to take anything away from the response that the districts and
Yeah.
individuals did, because it was commendable, and
They
some
stepped
districts
up.
responded in such a rapid manner. It was just incredible and inspiring. But I think you're spot on when we talk about the one of the legacies is going to be, we just cannot go back to that again. We cannot have situations where there's the have and have nots. It's not just, I mean, this is a big one. It's not just about racial inequity. It's about
Oh yeah.
socioeconomic inequity. It's about all equity and making sure that
Yeah.
there's access to that. And
Well, special ed has been hit very hard. Yeah, in particular
absolutely.
too.
Do you think there's anything that we maybe, as you reflect on, because everything was acute in the spring, we had to just respond, and it was like triage. Let's figure this out. And now in some respects we've kind of settled into, many districts have settled into remote learning, and is there anything maybe that we overreacted to or got wrong last spring? I don't know that there is. I'm just curious from your perspective. Another way of putting this, were there any aspects that we overcorrected and are now realizing that maybe we didn't have to be so drastic, and that things would be a little bit more seamless? Again, I'm just truly asking. I don't really have a thought of anything, but what are your thoughts around that? Any overcorrections that maybe we could settle back
Yeah,
into?
that's a good question. I don't know that we implemented like suddenly and then realized, oh, we really didn't have to do that
Hmm.
as we did that. There might be a few things with grading
Yeah.
that we kind of this is all lost. We got it wrong. And then on perspective from the long lens looking back, maybe we didn't have to implement it right at that moment or later,
Hmm.
that sort of thing.
Hmm.
But when it comes to instructional design, I think we were all in a place of great fear and we didn't know. And so the idea of closing schools down, right away, we don't know what we're gonna do.
Hmm.
I think one of the false things I think a lot of leadership thought teachers could get up and running over one weekend, to go from live classroom and that. And so there are so many people I know that do distance learning and they prepare for months and months and months, if not a whole year.
Right. Yeah.
And then they're ready for their course. And then we as teachers do it in 1 week or in one weekend.
Right.
And that was a shock to people that, oh, teachers just can't automatically do it. And I said, well, it's a completely different medium. And the things we normally rely upon, we don't have anymore in our fingertips and, that sort of thing. And so I think that's probably,
Yeah.
what we could do. One of the other things that drives me nuts and I think perpetuates some of our problem is a blind adherence to the timeline, the school calendar.
Yeah.
That, oh no, we got to follow the calendar. I mean, no, the year has to end when it ends. No, report cards have to come out when they come out, that kind of thing. And they really don't. And looking back on it, we could have said, no, the school year is going to be extended into the summer. And no, they didn't get it this year, which is, last beginning or that March, May, April, May time and June time. They didn't get it. So we're going to do an e-portfolio or a digital portfolio that will follow them into the following year. And so now this whole year, you're allowed to go back and learn stuff from last year and get credit for it.
Right.
That sort of thing. And some schools said, no, we're just going to shut it off. And I don't know that, that was a wise thing, that now we need to open ourselves up and go, oh, the calendar is actually what's getting in our way of some of this stuff. And of course, that's led to a huge, and that and other things have led to a huge upturn in the number of Fs. And I'm sure you're getting calls like I am. Hey, we have an 83% increase in Fs.
Right.
What are we doing there? So that gets into the grading conversation if you want to have that sometime.
Yeah.
But that's an issue. That would be the only place right now where I thought we might have corrected, at least in my initial response to you.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because that is one area where I think, in the short term, it was wise to make those decisions about the grading scale. And yet I worked with a lot of schools in March and April and May that said, Tom, we have an all year schedule. We have a linear schedule where we have had enough evidence and we think we can piece together the fourth quarter of learning that we actually can justify the way we're grading. And I think that now, as I'm sure you have as well, as I work with teachers in schools and they're getting used to this virtual environment, they're saying to me, Tom, I really am gathering and eliciting high quality evidence from students that I can look at along a gradation of quality with a rubric. So I think you're onto something there where I think, we had to make some decisions because of the uncertainty. And of course, there was the anxiety and stress of it.
Sure.
But I think we could settle back into, maybe not what we used to do, depends on what the district was doing, or the state or the province, but settling into a balance and just ensuring, at least even during the pandemic, we could still, assess high quality work and grade that work, but making sure that our grading practices are not exacerbating the inequities amongst students and things like that, and putting that fail safe
Oh,
in.
I agree with that. Just as soon as you say that, I'm nodding in agreement. Yeah, a lot of teachers are reporting they're getting good assessment. But I worked with a school yesterday, and it's been dozens of schools too, who have also said, I got kids who are just doing Minecraft off to the side and not participating in class, and they're just outright not showing up, and they're not
Right.
turning things in.
Mm-hmm.
What do I do? And so I was doing a grading seminar during these conversations for them, and they said, but wait, no, they're just not engaging. They're not doing the stuff. And I said, well, we need to talk about that outside of the world of grading, because that's a different issue.
Right.
It's an emotional response. It's relationship. It's what do we know about how to create tenacity and perseverance, stick-to-itiveness, motivation in kids. And they're shouldering more and more of the burden of trying to maintain attention. So are we doing more voice and choice and student agency, or are we taking that away from them? And there's not a lot for them there. And there's a lot of other responses to that, not the grading response. Yeah. So just as soon as I'm nodding with you saying, yeah, teachers are getting some good stuff that's evidentiary of performance, there are other schools who are struggling with, they're not even showing up for my sessions. And so we talk about asynchronous versus synchronous and all of that comes to mind. So I don't want to generalize that everybody is. And I want to point out that a lot of people now, and again, it might be a positive, are realizing, oh, I need to pay a lot more attention to student engagement than I did before, because I could just assume it before, whereas now I have to earn it, so to speak, or I have to facilitate it more proactively than I've ever done before.
I think that's the point, is that every district and every school has to make a decision. So when you see a news story from Virginia and you see a news story from Texas, or you see a news story from California, and they've gone in one direction, that doesn't necessarily mean your district has to go in that direction, or your school has to go in that direction, because that might be right for their context. Whereas, say in Virginia, you're dealing with, a different situation where you are or are not eliciting great evidence from kids that you're able to look at and examine. So it's one of those things. It's hard to pinpoint a ubiquitous policy for such, unique, nuanced circumstances. I want to take a bit of a big picture, view of education, and just, you've had a long, illustrious career. And I want to ask you a question about where we are in 2021. We're going to maybe just set COVID aside, of course. I know it's hard to, but we're going to do this for this discussion. What aspect of education are you somewhat disappointed in? I know, Rick, that you are a positive, optimistic person. You can't, your energy is contagious. I know that. And I feel very positive and optimistic too, but I wonder about the aspect of education. What aspect of education did you think we would be much further along with by 2021 than we are right now?
Well, I hate to, sing the same tune over and over again, but I totally thought when I started working on grades, ethical grading in 1980, 81, that we would be at a point of ethical grading. And that we would also be much more well-versed in descriptive feedback and all the techniques associated with that. That's one. And secondly, I thought racism in the education, schools can almost be an oasis of really the way society should be if they really want to do it. And unfortunately, I think it's just, again, it's exacerbated, have and have nots. Some schools have resources, some don't. And I'm very disappointed that we have not evolved as a species to realize the value of putting energy and time, even if you don't have children in the school system locally, that putting energy and time and taxes into really strong education, local community serves all of us well, because those kids will one day be our dentists and our leaders in politics and so on, and fixing our cars. And it just raises everybody when education is going well. The other idea that, I'm kind of disappointed that fine and performing arts is the first thing to go. And a lot of times when there's economic disparity, when those are the very things where students find meaning, and we have overwhelming research, there's not a doubt in anybody's mind that fine and performing arts, significant participation in that actually improves participation in all the other subjects that we call core, whatever that might be, the main subjects. And so we're shooting ourselves in the collective foot by diminishing that. That I thought would be better by this point. And then number of teachers who are, I'm disappointed, number of teachers who are not trained in learning disabilities, moderate autism, moderate spectrum, Asperger's, things like that. Because a lot of those kids are in our classes and we need to respond to them. And it's just as legitimate as any other kid in the class. And we need regular ed to have some training in those things. Special ed getting in the hands of regular ed teachers, I guess is what I'm trying to say, would be helpful. And then I thought we would be doing block scheduling, extended length classes, because we realized how unbelievably inappropriate 50-minute classes in a constant stampede through the day tires anybody, and you can't really learn the stuff. We know better. And if we had set up schools way back in the day with what we know today about how the brain learns, we wouldn't have set them up like this, this kind of conveyor belt thing. And so that bothers me a lot. And I thought we should have evolved by now. And then one thing that has disappointed me of late is technology and using it for its own sake, rather than looking at the pedagogical principles and finding tech to support that. And so they're doing tech because it's tech, not because it's useful, and not because it's valuable or reflects what we know about how the brain learns. And I just want to be very cautious with that. ISTE is really exciting to go to the ISTE conference and any education conference and technology conference, but it really has to be purposeful and used in a thoughtful way. I've lost count on the number of teachers who I've been observing and mentoring, and they've spent 20 minutes trying to get the tech to work or to integrate it in, and they could have done it much better in about 2-minute chalk drawing on an old chalkboard. They could have conveyed way more, or using the students' bodies to model something, and the tech got in the way. It took away from the momentum, away from the effectiveness. So that's another disappointment, I guess, to some degree. But I guess the other last thing is like teachers pay teachers sometimes at that website and that company and others. I've seen an increase in the number of things that are sold as, oh, here's my stuff I made up, that are using materials from other people and are not giving attribution to that. And that's been very disappointing that, you write a book and you say, here's my great idea, but that's actually an idea that I saw in this other person's book, 15 years ago. I don't mind if you want to promote it, it's fine, but we just remind them of where it came from. That would be good. I'm sorry, I'm ranting a little bit.
No, it's
those are my disappointments.
I know you've experienced that. I have too, where you happen to catch a glimpse of something. It doesn't happen often, but you catch a glimpse of something online or a slide or a quote on Twitter and you go, that sounds awfully familiar. Awfully familiar. I was thinking as you were going through your list there, grading for sure is, something that I still frequently will say to participants and people I work with. We've been teaching to standards for at least 2 decades, if not longer. And yet here we sit in 2021, and the notion of grading based on the achievement of those standards is still controversial. That's standards-based.
We had Benjamin Bloom and Mastery Learning launched us. And so that was in the 60s. We should know by now. But
and in the other bigger picture, you mentioned, just with the publicly funded system, and I don't know what the answer to this is, but public school especially is always sold as the great equalizer. And I don't think it's ever lived up to that, because to this day, we know that zip code is still a major factor in your achievement levels. And so I don't know what the answer to that is, really. I haven't really, kicked that can down the road very long, but publicly funded systems are, like I said, sold to be that great equalizer. And yet, are they fulfilling that promise? It's, we don't want to harp on the disappointments. There's a lot to be disappointed with. And a generation from now, there'll be another podcast asking about what would you think we'd be further along? And they'll have a list of things as well, because that's just how it goes. However, I want to finish with the positives, because I know that's your disposition and your optimism and all of that. Let's finish with something a little more upbeat. What breakthroughs do you think education is on the verge of making? Like, I don't mean this flippantly, because I'm with you on the tech I think sometimes we have to say to people, what do you want to do? And then find the tech that does that, as opposed to just grabbing the latest technology that someone's, thrown out there on Twitter. So I don't mean this flippantly from the point of view of what's the next fad or what's the next trend, but I mean, like, what is the next big thing that educators should be preparing themselves for, and most importantly, should be really excited about?
Well, it was hard for me to limit myself to one as I was thinking about that. So sorry, man.
Go for it.
It may not be cogent.
The microphone is yours, my friend. Go ahead.
One of the things that I'm thinking that more and more people are going to do is we look at personalized instruction, and then what has happened with online tutorials and people using online learning, remote instruction, and so on. Is I do think there's going to be increased interest in what colleges have been exploring, and I know that some high schools, but not very many, have been exploring it. But now I think it's going to go high schools and middle schools and maybe elementary, and that's micro credentialing and digital badges.
Yeah.
That will follow you throughout your school year. So I will have a digital badge that represents my actual training and certification in Python that will follow me wherever I go, or C++, whatever. But it also might be in German, and it might be in French. And the idea that instead of a staid approach of a stagnant, you always have to take this, you always have to take this, there are going to be some core classes I take, but then I get to personalize and make my own journey and carve my own degree, so to speak. And colleges have been doing that for a while, but I've seen it now more and more with high schools. Museums now are quite a bit, a number of them are doing digital badges. You get a training in archaeology because you did, a 1, 2, or 3 day course on it. It's now certified, and you pass some test, and you're kind of, at least initially certified in that particular thing. So that's going to be huge. I've also been talking a lot about, with my daughter, in fact, who's graduated in GIS 4 or 5 years ago, Geographic Information Systems, in the School of Engineering, about, the visualization and graphic portrayal of data. And I think that millennials and younger, and a lot of people they're millennials, are in the teaching force right now.
Right.
But certainly the next generation, the generation that's currently in school, are very comfortable with graphic representation of knowledge. Whereas people in my generation, it's a steeper curve to do that. But the idea of visualization of knowledge as a way to teach that, and then through that, the revelation of patterns otherwise unseen. Political, my daughter and I have been talking about this with cartography. If I draw a map a certain way, that person has a lot of power. Politics, kings have been tumbled because of the way a map was drawn. Yeah. Today, with satellite imagery, we can see a lot of cobalt deposits in a certain region of the country, and you're cobalt rich. But I can change the color scheme, and suddenly there's no cobalt there, and you have no cobalt, and you're not rich, and so your power wanes. So the manipulation of graphics, but using graphics to reveal things. And I think that has power in grading too, that we report graphically how you're doing against standards or learner outcomes, not just symbolically with a letter grade, a percentage, a rubric number, is huge and is coming down the road. That'll be an exciting thing. I'm also, this might be naivete. It might be just hopeful thinking, but I'm thinking as we're getting farther and farther away, more entrenched in our own little self-serving communities, there is going to be an opposite reaction of saying, whoa, we need to come together again. And I'm finding that outdoor education and environmental ed kind of stuff, ropes courses, will make a resurgence. A lot of offices of risk management in some schools were like, oh no, don't do a ropes course. Don't go hiking in that steep mountain. Don't do that dangerous thing. You're going to go sea kayaking? Oh, I don't think so. And this is actually, I think we're going to go back into adventure touring or eco touring. And more of the ropes course. We're going to take the kids out on a ropes course for a whole day or 2 days. I think that's going to make a resurgence, and that's going to be a positive, because it's going to bring us back to my highest calling is to serve. And I find meaning in that, rather than I am so entitled to this. Right. In other words, how am I a hindrance to our advancement, or how am I helping our advancement? Am I solving the problem? I'm not. I think that will come back. That would be quite exciting. I think we're also going to have a real serious heart-to-heart with the extent to which we give power to standardized test scores as being the sole diagnostic. of a teacher's performance, let alone the student's performance.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, don't get me
Yeah.
started on value added measures
Yeah.
as we do that. And then the renewed focus on the haves and have-nots, trying to close that up. Oh, big thing will be University of British Columbia, Simon Fraser, McGill, all the education universities are going to now have to reflect teacher realities and the online stuff. And so, right now they might have professors working who don't teach according to the reality of the modern classroom. Right. And there's going to be a call on teacher preparation programs to change. Yeah. I also think, and you could say cynically or happily, I don't know, but we're going to improve our online tutorials because we've had to. Yeah. And so with that, there's going to be a commodifying of that. Right. So there's going to be a lot more merchandising, and people are going to quit the teaching field and just do online stuff. Toward that end, I think some schools are doing it wisely, where I've heard of 2 teachers now are going to have 2 classes. They're going to share their classes. One teacher is going to do the live asynchronous, and another teacher is going to spend all the time just designing the synchronous online modules and, the interactive bit with that as they do that. And they're going to now have 50, 60 kids between them, but you're not going to have the teacher who does just the live teaching, and also has to do the online tutorials. Right. That's going to split it. That's good. And I'm really excited about this. I think there's going to be a resurgence in year-round school. We're going to get away from the whole summer off because so many kids are missing things and they feel like they need to keep up, or urgent and regular in their lives. And I think that will open things up quite a bit as they do that. And then just what we mentioned before, and I'm excited about this, that people will feel like they can be gently insubordinate with the school's calendar, the timeline, that, the kid didn't learn in this amount of time, he gets more time. Who cares? He learned earlier, then don't mire him in what he already knows, move on. But you don't have to be beholden to an arbitrary timeline imposed on the next generation, which flies blind to everything we know about human psychology and the way students learn. So that's my top list. I don't know of anything else beyond that.
that is a lot to be excited about for sure. And if even half of that came true, I can't imagine the transformation we would see in education. Rick, I really appreciate this conversation. I know it's just the first of many times that we will convene here on the podcast, and looking to at some point in the future have you come back for a specific question or a conversation about assessment or grading, or would have conversations about differentiation. So we're going to finish up today. So I appreciate that. We're going to finish up today with a segment that I've now sort of rebranded as 3 questions. I used to ask 5, but now I've cut it to 3 just for the sake of efficiency. So I'm going to ask you 3 lighthearted questions so listeners can get to know Rick a little bit more on a personal level. Nothing too intrusive.
And I'm sorry, Tom, our time is up. Thank you for playing our game.
That's right.
Go ahead.
All right. So here's the first one. What junk food is your kryptonite? It is the junk food that you simply cannot resist and you will overindulge every single time.
Oh, well, pecan pie is especially if it's chocolate pecan pie, but that's not really a junk food, but that's one I can't resist no matter what, wherever I am. I might say Milky Way bars.
Okay.
Or chocolate covered marshmallow, anything. Oh, no, I know. Milk Duds. I know that sounds really weird, but I like chewy and I like a little chocolate and caramel. So yeah, Milk Duds.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Yeah. Well, pecan pie is not healthy, Rick. So it is
kind of
a junk food.
Okay. Yeah, it's true. It's true. But it's a decadence. I don't know.
There you go. I know. Mine is peanut butter cups. I could probably eat 17 of them without batting an eye and then pay for it. But man, in the midst of it, I can't resist. All right. Now I'm asking this next question more from the fun angle, not the serious angle. Okay.
Okay.
So what isn't illegal that should be illegal?
What isn't illegal?
What isn't illegal from a fun perspective, not from a serious perspective. So I'll give you my example. My example is it should be illegal in 2021 to pay by check when you're in a store. That should be illegal. To pull out your checkbook. Okay, that should be outlawed.
That's really clever.
Okay, no one should be able to pull out their checkbook, especially if the cashier has already totaled your amount and you're then going, "Oh, where's my check?" I don't think many people pay by check anymore, but if they do, it should be outlawed. That's mine. Any thoughts? What isn't illegal?
I was just thinking of serious ones when you said that. I mean, like, you shouldn't be able to get an adjusted rate mortgage an arm if you don't have the capacity to follow through when it changes,
Yeah,
in 3 years
yeah,
or 10 years
yeah,
or whatever it is. That's too serious.
yeah.
I don't know.
Way too serious.
Some forms of bungee jumping
There you go.
uh, would be it should be illegal,
Yeah,
but it is illegal in some places. But we do it nonetheless.
yeah.
Uh, I
Any unwritten
oh I
travel? How
know.
about? Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was thinking drones, man. We got so many drones flying around the neighborhood, and I'm
Yeah.
just so afraid. They're gonna knock into something or knock something over or fly into birds. Their drones can be fun for filming, maybe fly up once in a while, but the idea that everybody gets a drone and that Amazon might start delivering, well, is in some places delivering by drone, I think should be illegal. All right, thank you.
Just wait until the crashes happen. The other one I was thinking was when you're boarding a plane, it should be illegal to pretend you're mindlessly wandering up to the front to read the screen when what you're really doing is trying to cut the line. We all know what's happening. We know what you're doing. Don't pretend you don't know where you're going and then go, oh, are we boarding now? And then slip into the line. We all know it's going on. That should be illegal.
Oh, I know. Speaking of that,
Yeah.
when you're at the gate, and it should be illegal for you to sit next to the only outlet in the entire gate area, and you're not plugging anything in.
Right.
And the rest of us are trying to plug something in. Excuse me, can I sit on the floor and worship at your feet and just use the plug that you're not using?
That's right. That's right.
That should be illegal.
Yeah, dude's you have to pay a cover charge to use the outlet because he's sitting there blocking it. I know. All right, last one. What do you think would be the worst buy one, get one free sale of all time?
That is so bizarre.
What's the worst?
Buy one, get one?
Buy one, get one free. I was thinking accordions or bagpipes.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. What's the worst?
It would be awful to get two of when you only really barely need one. Oh, I know, your personal colonoscopy kit. That would be the worst.
That's right. That'd be the worst. Here we go again, Mr. Wormeli.
Yeah, here we go.
Well, sir,
taking it down the wrong road there.
That's right. You bought two. You might as well. Anyway.
Let's just keep it going.
I digress. Okay.
Yeah.
Last question. One final question. We're going to get back to being a little bit serious here. One of the things, Rick, that I'm doing with the podcast, big picture, is trying to focus on the concepts of, success and happiness. And down the road with the podcast, I may start to expand and bring in some different, maybe non-educators and talk about these topics. But for now, what I'm trying to do with the interview is finish the interview by asking this one simple question of everyone who's been on the podcast. And that is, if a random person stopped you on the street and said, or asked you, what is your definition of success? How would you answer them?
Probably, I don't know, three parts, I guess. I'm thinking again. One is to love, and to love fiercely. Mm-hmm. It could be a person, it could be an experience, but to love, to have that, devotion, that dedication. The second is to remedy injustice. Mm-hmm. That I feel like I've succeeded when I have remedied a wrong, or changed a wrong, corrected a wrong, or remedied an injustice. Something that was unethical that I changed, and somebody's aspect or success was able to do that. And then I think to be able to see the world through new eyes, mm-hmm. on a regular basis would be very successful. If you see it through the tired, same old filter and lens, there's probably not much out there for you. But to constantly conduct yourself in such a manner is one, that you're accessible. Other people see you as approachable, mm-hmm. but then you choose, I guess it's a gentle form of empathy, but to be able to see it through different eyes. And then to come at the same things and see it anew, like I think T.S. Eliot once said, is the ultimate goal, is to see it through the child's eyes and see it constantly new. That's quite a bit of success in your life. So I'll just take those three. Bob, what do I win?
You win the prize for what I think is a inspiring and deep answer. I really appreciate that, Rick. Rick, I can't thank you enough for joining me today. Again, I look to have you back at some point in the future. I always appreciate your perspective, your humor, your wisdom, And I think listeners do as well. So listeners, I would really encourage you to follow Rick on Twitter. He is a great Twitter follow, lots of great content and lots of great inspiration from Rick himself. That's at Rick Wormeli 2, the number 2. At Rick Wormeli 2 is the Twitter handle. And also to check out Rick's website, some great resources there, information about how to book Rick for trainings and consultations, etc. That's www.rickwormeli.com. Rick, thanks again for being here, and I really look forward to next time.
Hey, Tom, thank you for all you do for our profession and humanity. We're lucky to have you.
I appreciate that, Rick. Thanks so much. Have a great day. In Assessment Corner this week, I want to address the idea of atypical assessment methods. Now, given the length of the interview with Rick, I'm going to split this into 2 parts. So part 2 will come next week. Today I'm going to talk about the why, and next week we'll talk about the how. And my focus today is going to be on engineering conversations and observations. Now, COVID has, of course, forced us to reconsider what counts as authentic evidence of learning. Now, that was a conversation that I think was long overdue, but the fact that it happened is really a positive. Now, let's be clear. Everything is evidence that teachers can use to make summative judgments about learning. If you feel compelled to only have traditional, tangible evidence of learning, then I would say that once this segment is finished, maybe go back and listen to the opening segment about professional judgment. Now, evidence is evidence, and all evidence can assist teachers in making sound decisions. Now, that doesn't mean everything should be quantified and entered into the grade book, but everything students do is evidence to help shape teacher judgment. In order to be as learner responsive as possible, as equitable as possible, as inclusive as possible, and as culturally responsive as possible, we have to force ourselves to embrace atypical demonstrations of learning, including the areas I mentioned, the idea of engineering conversations and observations. Now, I want to illustrate a level of awareness here. I'm calling these atypical demonstrations because they are atypical when compared to sort of white Eurocentric definitions of success. They're most certainly not atypical, quote unquote, in many other cultures. I'm just using that term to merely provide a contrast for comparison, right? But so many of these practices are embedded in cultures historically. So where, for example, is storytelling most prominent? Well, of course, North American indigenous communities and cultures, but also native Hawaiian cultures, and certainly many sub-Saharan African cultures also have that tradition. Those are just to name a few. Now, storytellers in most cultures were essentially meant to do 2 things, one of 2 things. One was to entertain and the other was to educate. So not only does embracing atypical assessment methods provide the broadest possible ways to elicit evidence during remote or hybrid learning, they also allow us to authentically add more culturally responsive ways of assessing. Now, I'm planning on doing a much more deeper dive, a more detailed look at the idea of culturally responsive assessment in a future podcast. Probably going to be a solo podcast where I have a little bit more time to kind of dig deeper. All right, okay, so back to conversations. Cassandra, Nicole, and I wrote about this in the book Instructional Agility. So why engineering conversations? Well, for learners, they gain a deeper understanding when they talk about what they are learning. And for teachers, we gain as teachers a deeper insight into learners' thinking when we have them articulate and talk about their learning. That provides us with more accurate information to interpret, and it allows us to make instructional maneuvers within sort of the instructional process. What are the benefits? Well, obviously for teachers, it gives us the opportunity to observe speaking and listening skills, so we get a chance to assess that. It also promotes productive group work and gives us the opportunity to teach things like collaboration. For students, engaging in conversations is an opportunity to co-create meaning, to gather emerging evidence from others they're listening to, and it kind of shifts the power, doesn't it? It allows students, or forces students in many ways, to be actively involved. It depends on how deep the conversation is. It might require some research, or it might require some in-depth analysis. So students will have to be actively involved in order to participate in the conversation. And of course, for both students and teachers, here's the opportunity to be inclusive and equitable. But that inclusivity and equity really can't be assumed, nor should we think it's automatic. Okay, so details matter. Precision in planning matters. Specificity with prompts matters. Protocols matter. So we'll get into some of those details next week. We need to push each other to put conversations, debates, discussions, storytelling on par with other more traditional forms of assessment. Now, partially because very little of what we communicate actually comes from the words we speak or write. And you miss some of this when everything is in written form or typed form, right? The vast majority of what we communicate comes from facial expressions and paralinguistic patterns, right? So paralanguage that modifies meaning or gives nuanced meaning or conveys emotion, right? So things like pitch or volume, intonation, cadence, tone, all of that also communicates where learners are. Now, the bigger picture of conversations is observations, the idea that teachers would observe learning. And deeper learning means teachers are going to require students to produce more complex demonstrations of learning. So that's going to increase our use of performance assessments. And a lot of times, those performance assessments will end up being anchored around demonstrations that teachers will be able to touch in the sense of a project or hear or see in order to assess them. So observations provide prime opportunities for teachers to make instructional maneuvers, but also prime opportunities to gather evidence. Again, fight the temptation to think all evidence has to be tangible. With so many digital platforms and apps right now, there's no shortage of opportunities to elicit evidence through these atypical demonstrations. Now, we'll talk details next week, but for now, if you're hesitant, don't be. Evidence is evidence, so these formats are just as valid, okay? Unless the standard says so, there's no reason a constructed response can't be oral. Now, administrators, you have to give sponsorship to this idea. Now, you might inadvertently be the one standing in the way of a more expansive view of valid evidence, right? I said inadvertently because I don't think you're doing this on purpose. So maybe take inventory on whether or not this is happening. You might not be, but maybe you are. One clue would be that if you are obsessed with gradebook entries, then, especially those policies where we say we need X number of grades in the gradebook per week, then you just might be, in some small, medium, or large way, getting in the way of this expansive view of what evidence looks like. So, okay, details next week, but for now, it's time to accept a more expansive view of what quality evidence looks like. That's all we have for today. Remember to follow the podcast Twitter account for updates. That's @TomSchimmerPod. My personal Twitter handle is @TomSchimmer. And also, please email your questions for Assessment Corner or any suggestions or feedback you have for me. It's tomschimmerpod@gmail.com. And again, as I said in the opening, don't forget to check out the YouTube channel where I'm going to be adding a lot of different features for 2021. Next week, my guest will be Katie Novak. We are going to explore everything about universal design for learning, so I'm really looking forward to that. Please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, especially on Apple Podcasts. That seems to be where your ratings and subscriptions go a long way to expanding the listening audience. Have a great week, everyone.